Pokemon's a bit of a hot topic this year, isn't it? With Pokemon Legends Arceus and the newest generation 9, Pokemon Scarlet and Violet now being a thing that year that is now going gaga over, more specifically Weed Cat.
Sprigatito! Spriga, spriga, sprigatito! Spriga, spriga, sprigatito! Spriga, spriga, sprigatito!
And I know that I'm jumping ahead because I still want to do more of my Pokemon perspectives, which you should totally check out the original video since there's a lot of time and energy put into it, but for now I want to talk about one of the more standout titles in Pokemon's lineup, Pokemon Colosseum. Gotta save 'em all. Quite the stark contrast from the usual gotta catch 'em all. That's because this was a brand new beast of a Pokemon game. It was the first console title that wasn't a battle simulation game. It had an actual story, characters, and locations that players could explore. It wasn't extremely deep, but it was noticeably darker than any Pokemon games prior to it, and if you ask me, it's still probably one of the darker titles to this day. In a time of RPGs with darker stories, this was quite a breath of fresh air for the Pokemon series. Colosseum is a game that you'd call firsts for the series. It was the first Pokemon game to not be developed by Game Freak, it was the first mainline console game, it was the first RPG game that didn't follow Pokemon's standard, and it was the first time you played as an older established character rather than a fresh new face starting out on their journey. One can only wonder what this young man's first step in this game would be.
This is the coolest thing I have ever seen.
Oh. Yeah, we start this game off with a bang, and certainly not a bad one at all. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Pokemon Colosseum is a different beast of a game, and that's on purpose. In an interview with Prima Games, Junichi Masuda, one of the bigger names in the Pokemon franchise development over the years, said the following: "How players communicate with each other has been key to the Pokemon games. It is the backbone of all Pokemon game designs. I feel that the handheld systems work better than the home-based consoles. It's certainly possible to come up with a concept for home-based consoles, but we might then have to change the core of the game." Man, hindsight is 2020 nowadays, ain't it? Genius Sorority, which I will be calling GS from now on, will be taking the reins with this Pokemon game, with it being the first major project that this company was tasked to make. And despite a few rough edges here and there, I like to think that Pokemon Colosseum's campaign is a very good one, even though it has its fair share of issues that I have with it. GS's take on Pokemon games is actually quite fascinating, especially when you consider the way that Generation 5, apparently the region Ore, was based off the city Phoenix, Arizona, which, look, I know Ore is a desert and Arizona is arid, but I think there's a bit more people than, forget it. But let's take a look at the game and talk about it for a little bit. And let's take a trip back 18 years into the past and look at the first and arguably best home console Pokemon RPG. I think the biggest aspect we should talk about when it comes to why Pokemon Colosseum is such a standout title amongst Pokemon games is the main protagonist, Wes. Now, if you're not familiar with Pokemon's formula, what the hell are you doing watching this video? So, I know that's a bit annoying, but please bear with me. Normally, in a Pokemon game, you're a fresh new trainer. You don't have Pokemon to your name, and you're essentially a goody two-shoes. Oh, and for some reason, most of the time, your father is nowhere to be seen. The only time in my memory that we actually had a father was Norman in Generation 3, and he was more interested in spending time in his gym than living at home. Man, that paints a sad life. Essentially, you're a blank slate, and there's nothing wrong with that. But when that's been the entirety of every mainline Pokemon game, to me, that kinda gets to be a problem. Now we've got Wes. And how do we meet him? Badass!
That's what I'm fucking talking about?
I've said this before in my videos, more recently in my Pokemon Legends video, that one of the biggest problems I've had with the main protagonists in Pokemon is that you barely have anything to your character. And yeah, immersion is a thing, but that doesn't mean you can't have a pre-established past, and with Wes here, there's a lot you can glean as you play the game. The first is that he used to be a part of the evil team of the region of Ore, Team Snag'em. You're essentially playing what amounts to be an ex-gangster who not only is badass enough to blow up his former team's base, but also stole one of the most important pieces of equipment. When Wes was being designed, he was meant to be a bit older, a bit darker. That's from one of the designers of the game, Akihiko Miura. I wanted to create a story that was a little different from the world of Pokemon so far. That's why the main character is about 17 years old and the color of the clothes is a little dark, or a little older brother. I don't think that's the right translation. Damn it, Google Translate! Anyway, Wes was older and already been established as a trainer. Hell, he was the best snagger on Team Snag'em. What's a snagger? We'll get to that later. But already you've got yourself something that a lot of people who are fans of Pokemon have wanted for a long time. Even before Colosseum came out, people wanted there to be a chance to be a part of an evil team in the games. Sure, not everyone wants that, but for the concept being a part of an evil team is still a very unique twist on a character, especially for Pokemon. Kinda makes me sad that we're still going back to the young kids part, and we're still going younger, especially with the latest generation being revealed. But here's the fun part. Wes is still a silent protagonist, so players can still step in his shoes throughout playing the game. Just because a character has an established backstory and motivations, that doesn't mean it's impossible for people to get immersed into the game's story. Hell, when I'm playing as Naked Snake in Metal Gear Solid 3, even though Snake has an established character, I can still do goofy things with him, and it can still be used to help with the player character's established traits.
I can't put it into words. I feel safe. Like this is where I was meant to be. Like I'd found the key to true happiness. Does any of that make sense?
Not even a little.
You should come inside the box. Then you'll know what I mean.
You could easily view Wes as someone who's trying to claw his way from his troubled past, or that he's still just a bad guy who's looking to get payback on Team Snag'em for some reason. What's the reason in-game? That's for you to decide. What I will say is that there are some very fun story beats that Pokemon does really well without expressly telling you, that give you clues on how Wes's former character is. Take for example his two starting Pokemon, Espeon and Umbreon. Unlike other evolutions at the time, these two require that you have max friendship with them in order to evolve the EVs. And when you start the game, Espeon has the move Return, which has its power be determined by the friendship level of the Pokemon using it. And when you use it in the game, it has max power. About how it can tell you stories and give details about the characters without expressly stating it. But for those who can't read between the lines, this gives a good clue that these two Pokemon are ones that Wes genuinely cared for rather than stealing them from other trainers. Deep down, he's a good guy, at least to his Pokemon. I do think they made Wes a little bit too cool, but it's hard not to think this is a cool character when he blows up a base, steals from an evil team, and rides off into the desert on a gestalt machination of a motorcycle. But unlike, say, a character who's supposed to be cool and tries too hard, like, off the top of my head, say...
It'll kill you.
He's an asshole.
Wes doesn't have an attitude. That's mostly because he doesn't have any actual spoken lines in the game, but hey, that's where the other characters come into play. The biggest one would be Rui. She's a sidekick character who has a gift when I talk about gameplay. If I can be honest, Rui isn't the deepest character. She doesn't have any Pokemon of her own, she does a lot of exposition, she starts off as a damsel in distress, she prevents Wes from stealing Pokemon that are normal, and if it wasn't for her power to see shadow Pokemon, she'd probably just be useless and be a talking piece for the players to see. Still, in the purposes of Wes's character, we learn that he's a bit of a lady killer. There's a lot of female NPCs that express attraction over him in the game, and there's a part in Pyrite where a female chaser tells Wes to ditch the wallflower. Ouch! Look, I personally think that while I appreciate the story and characterization of Wes, I do think there should have been the option to have a gender select for the lead here. Hell, make Rui the female lead and give her a female version of Wes's outfit. I'll design it for you, here you go! Not that hard. Also to point out, in the original Japanese, Rui did have her midriff exposed in a slightly shorter skirt. The skirt, I can understand, but apparently midriffs? Oh, we can't have that! Demonetize this video immediately! Back on point, I do appreciate the characterization that Wes does get, but if it wasn't for the gift that Rui got, she would be pretty useless as a character. I mean, I understand wanting to keep up with the silent protagonist that Pokemon has. At that point, you might as well give me a protagonist who speaks on his own. What, did you think I'd only had glowing praise for this game? Nah, I may love this game, but it has its own pitfalls, and I'll cover some of them in this, because I'm ominous, damn it! Back to the actual topic, gender selection for the main character has been a thing since the previous generation before this game came out. I'm going to give a little more leeway though, since GS did make this their first real project. GS was founded in 2002, with its operations being started in July of 2001. Colosseum was released in Japan of November 2003. Even if you want to say they started work on the game in 2001 when they were beginning operations, that means they got this game done in about less than 2 years. 17 months and we're being really rigid here. So I'm willing to give them a little leeway in that regard, especially when it comes to creating tons of assets. Outside the recycled models from the previous Pokemon Stadium games, still, for what they made, it is impressive. And Wes as a protagonist certainly makes him one of the more memorable protags in the series. Not just design-wise, but also concept. That is something I will certainly say GS did a great job at.
Great job.
Hooray, the wild, wild west of the Pokemon world. Quite literally. As stated earlier, the game was based on Phoenix, Arizona, which actually fits really well with the overall tone of the story, giving the vibes of a musky, dark, and dank wild outlaw west. For clarification, never been to Phoenix. For all I know, it could be a nice place. And that really plays to what the narrative of the game is going for, because there's a lot of darker story elements that do go on. You've got kidnapping, torture, political corruption, and worst of all, stealing other trainers' Pokemon!
History's greatest monster!
Although, considering that you do steal other trainers' Pokemon in broad daylight and in public, and none of them seem to come after you for taking their Pokemon, that paints a really bleak picture. Ora is known to be a rugged region that practically is run by criminal organizations, so either the people who live here are used to crime happening on a regular basis, or GS had a budget thing.
I don't have enough money for chicken nugget.
You also need to consider that Ore, there aren't any real wild Pokemon roaming about. At least in the first game. Ore is practically a desert wasteland of sorts, and while there are Pokemon who do live in deserts, it's really a testament to the world design and working with your limitations that they don't show up. Let me make it clear. While I have brought up the limitations of the settings, such as the lack of wild encounters and routes, the limited time I brought up you for development, you need to be able to work with what you don't have along with what you do to make these kinds of projects work. Don't have time to make routes or have programmed random encounters? You incorporate that into the story and setting itself. Not only is it a brilliant idea for working on what's really important, but it's also amazing to work within your limitations and bust out a product for everyone to enjoy. Hell, there's a reason why you basically just have mostly Johto Pokemon being used in the main story. Pokemon and Ore are a commodity, since there aren't any that are really native to the lands, but there used to be. They're basically imported in. When you go to the outskirts stand to buy Pokeballs, you learn that the Ore region did have wild Pokemon one time ago, but those Pokeballs that the clerk have are covered in dust. So you've got yourself a much darker setting and tone for the story. That isn't to say that there aren't moments of levity or comedy going on. There's a reason why this guy is known as one of the best parts in the game. It's because Mirror B is probably the biggest shock and standout considering the tone, which makes him more memorable, which helps with his theme, which is probably one of the best themes in the entire game, and one that people most often remember too because it stands out in contrast with the rest of the music. Since I am talking about music, and I think it's best that I bring it up here, because music is obviously a means of helping out the tone of the game, and since we're on a console instead of a handheld, that means there's a lot more that can be added to the soundtrack. Some notable songs to bring up are the Shadow Pokemon Lab music. Just listening to that jazzy harmonica makes a lovely earworm for everyone to enjoy. Speaking of jazz, you got Pyrite Town's theme. Really has that corrupted underbelly of a town that's made up of shady alleyways and people that would sooner trip you up and steal your wallet in the process. If there was a song that really represented Colosseum, it had to be this one. And I gotta say, this is a song I totally listen to if I had nothing better to do than to chill out on a warm afternoon in summer. Oh, and then there's the battle music. Like, holy hell, when you're listening to this, it certainly makes you feel very epic. I just wish we didn't waste this on a pink-haired guy named Willie with his 2 Zigzagoon while he goes vroom vroom! Like, no offense to Zigzagoon, I like the little guy, but when you hear this battle music for the first time, you're instantly pumped up for the battle. Couldn't we have gotten something a bit more epic than a couple of Zigzagoons? Like, they're able to evolve at level 20, why not at least have them both be at their second stage, Lanoon? It's just such a good battle theme, especially for Pokemon standards. I really love the soundtrack for Colosseum. It's probably the best part of the entire game, if you ask me. So, let me make it clear. Pokemon Colosseum has a few neat tricks and tips with the gameplay that make it stand out, obviously. Let's start with one of the biggest changes. The inability to catch wild Pokemon.
You what?
Yeah. Since the Nintendo GameCube was a pretty powerful beast, but not as powerful to include everything that a standard Pokemon game would have, like routes, encounter rates, and etc., GS decided to cut them out from the project. Now, there's still catching in the game, but how do you do that? Well, you make it so you can catch your opponent's Pokemon instead.
Hey, yo, what the fuck?
It's a fun concept. You're essentially jamming an action replay and inputting the code to catch your opponent's Pokemon. Not that I ever did that before. One of the core tenets of Pokemon's gameplay and lore for years up to this point was that you can't steal other people's Pokemon. It was a rule of the game that you couldn't do, so to be able to outright break that rule is something to take note of. Yeah, it's not one of the most standout parts of Pokemon, but it was a major tenet up to the point of this series. And one of the best ways to catch someone's attention for a long-running gaming franchise is to break one of those tenets. There's a reason why people want to break rules in programming, and this game allows you to do just that. Well, within reason, I suppose. You may have the device strapped to your arm that allows you to steal Pokemon, but Rui, the character who can see shadow Pokemon from different normal Pokemon, isn't going to let you steal the Ludicolo from Meyer B. You see, you can only catch shadow Pokemon. All other Pokemon are off the table. What's a shadow Pokemon, you may ask? Well, that's the second change that Pokemon Colosseum introduced. There's a new kind of Pokemon. A Shadow Pokemon. Shadow Pokemon are Pokemon that have had their hearts closed off. They're essentially experimented on and abused and turned into more brash fighting machines. Granted, they're a lot more volatile than regular Pokemon are and will even attack their trainers. Although that part isn't really a mechanic of the game though. But they're the only Pokemon you can catch in Colosseum, and unlike in this game's sequel, there's a fair bit more cons than pros to having a Shadow Pokemon. For example, while Shadow Pokemon can have other moves to them, the only Shadow move is Shadow Rush. A move that, while with a power of 90, has a nasty recoil damage to it. Shadow Rush doesn't have any type advantages or disadvantages to it, rather it just does neutral damage to any Pokemon regardless of type. So there really isn't any reason to use the move, and if your opponent continues to use it, then you run the risk of the Shadow Pokemon fainting and you won't be able to catch it. And that's a bad thing, since if you fail to catch the Shadow Pokemon during the initial battle, you're going to have to wait to get it at the Deep Colosseum, which will mostly be after the main campaign's story is mostly over with and you won't be able to use it during the main campaign. There's also the fact that Shadow Pokemon don't level up, at least not until you purify them, and once you do, you'll get a bunch of EXP built up shoved into them. But until then, they're essentially stuck with a shadow slapped onto them. It's not too big of a deal, but when you consider that you can only get 48 of the buggers, and some of those are extremely late game too, you can't even get a few of them until the after credits, and that's supposing you didn't knock out any previous Shadow Pokemon either. Even then, Shadow Pokemon have some nasty side effects. They may disobey and use another move, usually Shadow Rush. It may turn and attack its teammates. It may attempt to use its item even if it isn't holding one. It may hurt itself as if it were confused. It may attack its trainer or the opposing trainer, although that's still not a mechanic. It may do nothing at all. It may return to the Pokeball, and you can't use items on it. There's also Hyper Mode, which grants your Shadow Pokemon a very high critical hit ratio, mostly for Shadow Rush, and using other moves will usually result in a disobey. Now, while that's a problem, it's a double-edged sword. Sometimes you'll be forced to use a Pokemon you wouldn't normally pick for your team in the regular games. You start off with Espeon and Umbreon, two decent Pokemon at the time, but maybe you'll use the Sudowoodo that have a good physical defender, or Ursaring who has a decent normal type with a very high attack stat. The thing about unlimited deaths is that it forces the players to use Pokemon you wouldn't normally use. That's kind of a trap that Pokemon has, that if you keep using the same team every game, eventually things will get stale. It's part of the reason why I really like Generation 5, where you're forced to, in the first two games, to create a team specifically out of new Pokemon. Still, less than 48 isn't really going to cut it, especially when you don't get access to them early on. The sequel almost doubled the amount of Pokemon you could use, even allowing you to find wild Pokemon in a specific place called the Pokespot. But we're not talking about the sequel, we're talking about the original. I think that's probably the weakest part of Colosseum, the roster and how long it takes you to actually get access to them. Granted, you can also trade Pokemon, mostly with Generation 3, but you can't do that until you defeat the final boss, which I think is kinda bullshit. I also find it kinda total bullshit that you get Groudon and Kyogre on the cover of the game, but they ain't in the game. Sure, you can trade them into it, but you can't catch them. You want to talk about false advertisement? Talk about this crap! Back to the gameplay side of things, in order to purify a Pokemon, you need to get them to open their heart to you. Insert Kingdom Hearts joke here.
Keyblade!
But really, it's not a hard mechanic to understand. To have Pokemon opening its heart is the same mechanic as friendship, i.e. battling with Pokemon, walk around with the Pokemon on your team, rubbing your Pokemon with scents. Ew! You can also put them in the daycare, but I'm just saying that right now just to clarification on everything. There isn't really a way to have their hearts closed off more and more, so it's not really all that hard to open up their hearts. And I did bring up the EXP bomb drop onto the Pokemon, which is good. But in all honesty, I kind of expected more. I know this is going to be a bit of a BS on my part, especially since this game came out almost 20 years ago at this point, but on the off chance we get a remake or remaster, I wish that the Shadow Pokemon moves would be replaced with a move that the purified Pokemon can't normally use. Like this is done in a fan game Pokemon Rejuvenation. Take for example, having a Teddiursa learn Boomerang, or Vanillite learning Will-O-Wisp. I know that wouldn't happen, but we can dream, damn it! Then there's the battle system. It's pretty standard for a Pokemon title, with the only exception being that of a double battle for every battle you fight in, which can be good to add to the difficulty of the game. From simple things like a team having a Pokemon use Earthquake but its partner can't be affected by it, to the extremes such as using Will-O-Wisp on your own Pokemon to activate their Guts ability. Double battles have always been a very unique concept in Pokemon, and I can see why they're used in competitive play. It opens up a lot more strategies. For many, this game served as an introduction to competitive Pokemon, and was even used in quite a few tournaments back in its day. I will say, though, that there were times that in my latest playthrough, it was a bit of a slog at times. Not because of the battling system, but because I've gotten used to faster gameplay in more modern games, and it kinda hurts me to say that, but it's probably just a me thing. I also have to bring this up, but I kinda just like the saving system of the game. Like, you need to go to a save station specifically to save. Normally, in the old school games, I don't mind this, but Pokemon's always been able to save whenever you want, so this kinda sucked me out of the game a few times. However, Colosseum is one of my favorite Pokemon games because of the gameplay, and even if I have my own issues with it, I can respect it and work around them. I already talked about Wes and Rui earlier in this video, but I think I want to talk about the game really to try to take a bit more of a gritty and mature story and tone. I brought up things like kidnapping and possibly abusing Pokemon to turn them into shadow Pokemon. Colosseum was a glimpse into the adult world. As I stated earlier, some female trainers would flirt with Wes before a battle. Some places have bars that have liquor bottles on them. Oh, sorry, that's grape juice. Duh. Like, you got this dirty feel to the game, and hell, the Pokemon stand out because of that. These colorful creatures really do stand out from the backgrounds. Usually Pokemon games feature a bright and colorful world with specific themes that are more Japanese, especially up to this date when the game came out. The three regions before Colosseum were Kanto, Johto, and Hoenn. All of these had Japanese origins, were a lot more lush, green, natural. Some had too much water. And with Ore, well, we go dirty, dank, almost out of life. I'm not going to repeat myself, but the setting really is key to the overall tone of the story, making it a bit more mature. Still not on huge levels, but for a Pokemon game is quite an interesting take. Now granted, a lot of that is due to world design, music design, and character design, which you're probably thinking, duh, Kamen, way to state the obvious. And yeah, because while the story does have a few dark moments like the kidnapping, Pokemon usually has a lot of heavy lifting with its design work. Colosseum is no different, and even takes the rugged character models into account with the rugged design work here. I think what really works well with Colosseum is that it has its limitations, but works along with them in order to create this more mature look. And that's what really is impressive about Colosseum. Sure, the character models aren't the best in the series, and I'll admit some of them are a bit hit and miss. Like, a lot of the regular trainers look kinda not great. Then you get characters like Wes with his more mature and dark roguish design to make him stand out from the other protagonists in the series up to this point. Then you got Meyer B. He stands out with his, well, okay, one look should be enough to tell you why. I mean, have you seen that glorious hair of his? Also, if you reach this part of the video, type in the comments, let the music play. We get enough of those and I'll cover Pokemon XD in the future. Nazcaur, you know, I made a Kingdom Hearts joke earlier, but yeesh, I think you need to open your heart a bit more there, boy. In concept, the characters look good, but a lot of the jagged polygons and very rough looks make it a bit hard on the eyes sometimes. And that works for the game too. I know a few people will bring up the animations for the Pokemon, and don't get me wrong, they are pretty good, but the models certainly haven't aged well. Don't take this to mean that it ruins my enjoyment of the game though. To me, graphics are a secondary issue to me. I'm a guy who prefers gameplay and story over that. You can have the prettiest graphics in the game, but if your gameplay or story is lacking, I'm not gonna care. I mean, it's a side effect of me having grown up with every console generation to date since the NES. God, I'm old. Still, if I can go back to the original Metal Gear Solid, back to the original Persona 1 and 2, or even the original Pokemon games, well, mostly on emulators since those ones tend to be very slow, I can really appreciate Colosseum's art direction. I'll talk about this more when and if I talk about XD, the sequel to Colosseum, but I'm not too much of a fan of the more cartoony style that the models and world takes in the sequel title. Which is a shame because normally when it comes to art styles, I'm normally not that picky when it comes to it. Like, take the Legend of Zelda series for an example here. Ocarina of Time, Wind Waker, the Season games, Twilight Princess, they all have vastly different art styles and different quality, but I still enjoy them to different degrees, and I find them to be very artistically improved games. I don't know, I like Stadium, but it has a few problems here and there.
That's it! Stage clear!
Regardless of what you think, Pokemon Colosseum has been a fun trip down memory lane for me, and it's almost a crime that Pokemon and Nintendo have essentially forgotten about this game and its sequel. Neither one have actually been remade or remastered or even put onto the Switch. I legitimately believe that Pokemon Colosseum is probably one of the most unique official Pokemon games out there. And yeah, for the most part I've been critical of it, but when you love something, you're able to criticize it. And nowadays, anyone who doesn't already have the game or is able to emulate it is practically barred from it. It's hard to believe this, but nowadays video games have really gotten to the point where it's hard to get certain games, and some games are pretty much no longer available to people. I really don't like that, and right now if you go on eBay, you'll see a copy of Pokemon Colosseum from $60 up to the hundreds, and there's no guarantee that these copies will even work. Video game preservation is something that we really need to consider nowadays. There's a ton of older games that are being sold for exuberant prices, and it makes it hard for people to enjoy them. Perhaps maybe this is the wrong video to talk about this, but Pokemon Colosseum has a lot of charm, and it's probably one of the most unique Pokemon games that's been released by Nintendo out there. And I want people to be able to enjoy this title. Also, I'd be remiss if I didn't bring this up, but on Twitter, there's actually a fan game being made to pretty much encapsulate Pokemon Colosseum. It's done in pixel art, and I will provide a link in the description, and I want you guys to give them some support. I really want to see this fan project come to be. It looks really good. Sure, Pokemon Colosseum is a bit unpolished, but if you can get past the small inconveniences, Pokemon Colosseum is a gem, and it might be one of the best Pokemon console games to date. Not because it's the best gameplay, not because there's a lot of quality of life changes, but because it took a risk. And in my opinion, it succeeded. If you guys enjoyed this video, I hope you give it a like, subscribe, and hit the bell. I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your day. I'm MangaKamen, and I hope you examine your fandom. Bye bye.